So welcome everyone to this new SIPTA seminar. So we're quite happy to have Fabio Cozman talking to us. I'm happy to give the hand to Cassio de Campos, who will chair this SIPTA seminar. So Cassio.
Okay, good day. I'm Cassio de Campos from TU Eindhoven in the Netherlands, and I'm here to facilitate this SIPTA online seminar. It's my great pleasure to introduce Fabio Cozman. He has decades of experience in AI machine learning with numerous important results, including for imprecise probabilities but beyond. Fabio leads a strong group at the University of São Paulo in Brazil and directs the Impressive Center for AI in partnership with IBM and FAPESP. And his research spans from logics, knowledge representation, probabilistic reasoning, explainability to computational complexity theory, robotics, computer vision, and has attracted awards and thousands of citations. I met Fabio almost 22 years ago. His influential Credo Networks paper was just out. At that time, I started to study under his supervision, and his style of collaboration and supervision was always to admire. An open door, always ready for long discussions, an optimistic researcher at the core, strong scientist, great ideas. But let me conclude this introduction with an advice about lunch meetings. From the beginning, it was clear that I was not ready to have lunch meetings with Fabio. He was able to grab the food, eat it, discuss research, think about hardcore problems, and come up with ideas, and even some small talk while I was barely able to grab the food and start eating. So I think it was summer of 2005 when I was able to, I was about to finish my PhD, and I believe he thought I was ready for a bigger challenge. And we had a standing lunch meeting in front of a food truck in between buildings at Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh with the most spicy Indian food you can imagine. Surely I felt well prepared by him for that, but the food was hot and spicy, and so were the discussed topics. So a take-home message for you all. If you are lucky to have the chance of go for a lunch meeting with Fabio, be ready for great ideas and discussions. Order food smartly and don't play with your food. So without further ado, Fabio, the screen is yours.
All right. Well, thank you. Thank you for the invitation. Thanks for the introduction. I didn't know about the hot food and hot Indian food in Carnegie Mellon, but well, thanks for reminding me of the old times where we were collaborating here. It was very nice. It was really nice. So, well, let me start saying good morning to some people, good evening to others, good night to some. I guess this is happening around the world. So, good morning, evening, night, wherever you are. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for the invitation. It's really a pleasure to be here and share some thoughts on a topic that has been commanding a lot of attention within the area of artificial intelligence, a topic that has connections with imprecise probabilities. And what I will try to do in this talk is to actually show the connections as much as I can, to indicate why I think it's very nice to be in imprecise and indeterminate probability and work with this particular topic, and the topic is argumentation. But of course, there's a thing with AI, artificial intelligence, where people address very old problems and they start anew, and then they realize, oh, this has been discussed for 2,000 years. So let's go back and study it a little bit. So some of the things I'll say about argumentation, they'll be very narrow. There'll be the way people do it in AI. I guess people in philosophy and have been discussing argumentation for centuries. They may find what I will have to say a little too narrow. But anyway, so I hope to give a feeling about what's going on in AI. Right? What is it that we and AI refer to as argumentation, and how it's connected with imprecise probabilities. And in fact, there has been lots of connections between artificial intelligence and indeterminate, imprecise probabilities throughout the last few decades. I think I've done a few things. I've worked with Credo Networks. Some people are still doing it and very nicely. I decided to to talk about argumentation, because I think it's something that has a lot of potential. People from Imprecise Probabilities can actually contribute a lot, I think. And I would rather not talk about Credo networks anymore, because other people know more about Credo networks than I do at this point. And also, I think Credo networks are now something, a tool that can be used to deal with causality research. And I think other people like Marcus Affalon and Alessandro Antonucci are actually doing super nice work on causality with Credo networks. So they may discuss this in a different meeting. This is what I'll talk about, argumentation when you have uncertain arguments. Like I said, argumentation is very old topic. It's really old, and it's related to many different things. It's related to decision making. It's related to rhetoric, persuasion. It's related to negotiation. And from the old times, from the old Greek philosophers, there's been discussion on argumentation, and one important branch is the one that deals with deductive argumentation, where you use logic to deduce arguments. This is not really what's going on in AI when you talk about argumentation. You're dealing with other ways to represent arguments and to have arguments attack each other, and you may have conflicts, and you may have arguments that are defeated. So there's a different language to talk about argumentation now in AI, and it's a topic that has been hot since I think '95. It's narrow topic because people are not dealing with all of argumentation, but it's something that has been discussed continuously since '95, because in '95 there was a paper that was being really important. I'll mention that later. And so the focus has been on dealing and representing manipulating arguments, but also recently there has been a lot of work on mining arguments from various sources, text and speeches. Let me just say, spend some time discussing what is it that we refer as abstract argumentation frameworks in AI, and this term is due to Dung, a researcher who published a paper on this idea in '95, and the idea took off since then. So let's say we're discussing, and I say, oh, let's take a bus home. This is an argument. This is like it's very simple argument. It's just a proposition, but it's an argument. It's just something I propose, but it's called an argument. So the idea is that an argument can be anything. This is an abstract argument. You don't care about the structure. You don't care about how it's written down. It may be long, it may be short, but it's said to be an argument. And then you say, no, let's not take buses because there's a strike. So you're attacking my argument. That's what you're doing. And then someone else says, or maybe I will say, oh no, buses are working. So this new argument is attacking your argument. Okay. And now, so no one says anything else. So buses are working is an argument that is not attacked. So you might accept it. Now, if you accept that the buses are working, then it's attacking the next one, the fact that there is a strike, and because there's a strike, buses may be stopped, and then this is rejected. The next argument is rejected, and because it's rejected, now the other argument is unattacked. It's not attacked. Or to use a more technical term, the next argument is defended by the very first one. So you may accept it. So this is what we call an abstract argumentation framework. It's a bunch of arguments, things that are abstractly represented, and they stand up as arguments, and some of them may attack others, and this is the idea by Dung that was presented in '95. It's very simple. You have arguments, you have attacks, and you can represent these things by graphs, like the one I have here. So I hope you can see my mouse. You have these little boxes that are standing for, are representing arguments, and then you have arrows that are attacks. So A2 attacks A1, okay? The arguments themselves may be logic programs, they may be propositional formulae, they may be anything. Okay, and since 95, there's been a lot of work on extending Dung's framework to have not just attacks, but maybe you have things that support arguments that support other arguments. You may have preferences between arguments. You may have probabilities over arguments. This is something I'll talk about a lot in this talk. And then when you have an argumentation framework, then you may start accepting or rejecting arguments. And that's the whole thing. That's the whole interest in this area. So for example, you may accept A2 because A2 is not attacked. So, well, you may accept it. Now, if you accept A2, then you gotta reject A1 and A3 because they are attacked by something you accepted. Okay. Now with A4 and A5, it's more complicated because as you can see, these are arguments that attack each other. Right? There's a discussion, one argument attacks the other, but the other attacks the first one. So you might, for example, leave them undecided. So you're not accepting, you're not rejecting, they're undecided. Or maybe one accept one of them. You can't accept both of them, right? Because if you accept one, the other will be attacked. So you might just take one. So you might accept A5, and then you reject A4. Or you might accept A4, and then you reject A5. Okay, so these are the colors that I put here. Green means accept, red means reject, and blue means undecided. Okay, and when you color a graph like this, you have a labeling. Okay, you label all the nodes, you label all the arguments. Some of them are labeled as accepted, some of them are labeled as rejected, and some of them are labeled as undecided. So the labelings that you have for a graph are the sort of the semantics of the graph, the argumentation graph. They're the semantics of the set of arguments and attacks that you have. And then you may have more complicated things, like you may have an argument that defends another argument. So for example, here at the bottom, I have the same example as before, but now A2 is attacked by A6. But then A6 is attacked by A7. So actually, we might say that A2 is defended by A7, right? So that's the idea. So what happens in the abstract argumentation scheme of things is that you have different labelings. You have to choose amongst them. And the way you choose is you select the semantics for the argumentation framework, and the semantics indicates to you how to label the arguments, either accept them or reject them or leave them undecided. Okay, so there are many different ways to label. So there are labelings that are said to be admissible. Okay, what is an admissible labeling? An admissible labeling is one that you have no conflicts. So you can't accept something and accept something else that the first argument attacks. You can't, right? If you accept something, you have to reject everything that something attacks. So if you follow that prescription, you have an admissible labeling, basically. It's a little more complicated, but that's the basic idea. Now, if you take all if you start with some arguments and then you see all the arguments that are defended and you add them, you accept them, and now you see which other ones are defended and you accept them, and so on. You keep improving, you keep increasing the set of accepted arguments until you can't. Then you have a complete labeling. Okay. And if within the complete labelings, you select ones, the ones that have the smallest number of accepted arguments, then you have a grounded labeling. Okay. And if you choose the ones that have no undecided arguments, then you have the stable labelings. Okay. So there are different ways to choose the labelings. And I just wrote here the things that I just said. So you have admissible labelings, basically conflict-free You cannot accept an argument and accept some other argument that is attacked. That's the basic idea. You have the complete arguments, where you keep adding accepted arguments as long as they are defended. You have grounded, where you have the smallest number of accepted arguments, and then you have the stable ones, the ones that have no undecided arguments. So this is an stable labeling, because there's nothing undecided here. Okay. So let me give you an example. So you have these the very same example, and then I could leave them all undecided. Just leave them undecided. Well, if I do that, there is no conflict, right? So it's admissible, but it's not complete, because A2 is defended, because A2 is not attacked. So it's defended. So you should accept it if you're looking for a complete labeling. Okay. So if you're going for a complete labeling, you have to accept A2. And then you have to reject A1 and A3. Now, you might leave A4 and A5 undecided, but you might choose one of them to be accepted, or the other. So these are different ways in which you can handle these argumentation graphs, where you have arguments abstractly represented and attacks. Okay, and that's the review I wanted to make about abstract argumentation theory in the style of Dung. Okay, the way Dung presented in 95. I hope that was clear enough. Now, obviously, you might say then, well, look, several arguments have uncertainty embedded in them. And I think there are basically two ways uncertainty can show up. One way is when the argument itself depends on a fact that you're not sure about. For example, suppose you're arguing about climate change, and then you say something like, well, it's likely that if there's less ice in Greenland, then the ocean will be the water in the ocean will be less dense, and then there will be a disruption in the Gulf Stream. It's likely. Well, it's very likely, but it's likely. And the argument depends on whether it's more likely or less likely, but it's the probability is within the argument. And then there's a different sort of uncertainty where you're uncertain about the individual who is expressing the argument. So someone says, oh, look, there's a strike and the buses are parked, but you don't trust him. It may be fake news. So there are different ways in which arguments can be uncertain, but for us here, it doesn't matter. So arguments may be uncertain, you may be uncertain about them. Okay, you may not know whether their status. And so it's natural to think about probabilistic argumentation and or in some way to include probabilities into the picture here, because everything I said so far is just, just attacks, and you want some arguments attack others, and you accept or you reject. There's no uncertainty so far. But people have been discussing uncertainty within the context of argumentation frameworks for some time. And I think the first group that actually devoted sustained effort to discuss probabilistic argumentation was the group by a group of people led by Rolf Hennig. I think they started before 2000. In fact, I think Hennig was at SIPTA a couple of times. Maybe a number of people in the audience know him. And this group discussed probabilistic argumentation in a very interesting way, using a language that was close to probabilistic logic. So what they have is just a historical point here. I will not talk much about this theory. I think it's a theory that deserves more attention. It was sort of overtaken by the Dung style argumentation stuff, but I think it's worth mentioning. So what they have is they have assumptions. The assumptions are propositions that are assigned probabilities to, like you have the probability of fever and you have the probability of rain. And then you have arguments. The arguments are logical formulae, proposition logical formula that may imply other propositions. Like, for example, the argument here is not fever and not rain. That's the argument. The thing that is in the box here is the argument in their theory. And that argument supports party because it implies party, right? If there's no fever and there's no rain, then there's party. That's the idea. And what they discussed in their work, which was developed throughout for about 10 years. I think the last publication of this was 2009. They discuss how this can be interpreted using Dempster-Shafer theory. Okay, and so they use the language of belief functions. They call belief functions. They refer to belief functions as degrees of support, and it's really a nice connection to some a concept that appear a lot in SIPTA and in the SIPTA community as a whole. But like I said, I think this way of doing things was not taken by many people, and I think it would deserve a visit at some point. But some other proposals have been gathering a lot of attention. One of them is by Lee and colleagues in 2011. They proposed a way of doing probabilistic argumentation. So let me explain what this is. So they have arguments as before, and they have attacks as before, and they have graphs. Some arguments attack other arguments, but then you're allowed to assign a probability to an argument. Like, for example, here you're assigning 0.5, and I hope you can see it, to argument A2. Now, how is it interpreted? What is it that they do? They think this way. Well, there's a probability half that A2 is in the argumentation framework. And then with probability half, you go to the left, okay? And you have A2 in the argumentation framework. Now, with probability half, you do not have A2. So you remove it. And you go to the right, and you have a different argumentation framework. Now, let's say I ask you, well, what's the probability that you accept A1? Because that would be a sensible question to have. Now, if you go to the right, then you have to accept A2 because A2 is not attacked, and then you reject A1. If you go to the left, sorry. If you go to the left, you reject A1. If you go to the right, you have to accept A1 because it's not attacked. Okay, so basically, the question is, what is the probability that A1 is accepted? And the answer is half, right? Because there are two scenarios, one scenario in which A2 is there, and one scenario in which A2 is not there. And depending on these scenarios, A1 is rejected or accepted. Okay, so this is the probabilistic argumentation scheme by Lee and others, and it's now called the constellation approach, which is a funny name, but I suppose it's because you have a constellation of graphs, right? You can keep and remove arguments, and each way you keep or remove them, you have different graph. Now, what happens if you have more than an argument with a probability? Now, suppose you have the same example as before, but now you have half attached to A1, A2, and half attached to A5. Okay. Well, now one thing that people do is they assume that these arguments are independent. That's fair, right? You would expect this. So we don't know anything, so let's assume that they are independent. But these assumptions are actually quite strong. So some people have considered what happens when you do not assume independence. Okay, and I think in this community it should be clear what happens. You get a set of these possible distributions that are implied by these constraints. So you have the constraint that the probability of A2 is half, the probability that A5 is half, and then you have a set of probability measures that satisfy these constraints. And this is something that has been studied, was published recently by these researchers from Italy, Bazinga, Fleschi, and Fufaro. They published this at ICHCAI. which is really a top conference in artificial intelligence, discussing exactly what happens when you do not have independence assumptions. Now, this constellation approach, if you think about it, either in the independence assumption case where you have precise probabilities, or in the no assumption case where you have credo sets, any way you look at it, it's basically you are looking to an agent that is arguing from the outside. Like you're looking at him, you look at her, she's arguing, and you're saying, oh, we should keep this argument or not. Because it's a little strange if you think about yourself, right? You cannot erase an argument from your mind, in a sense, right? What's the probability that you have an argument or not? It's a little strange if you think this way. So I guess here the intuition is that you're looking at someone and you're saying, well, what's the probability that this person will have this argument in her mind? And then there's another different approach, which is a lot more connected to indeterminate probabilities than the previous one, which is the epistemic approach. And this appeared in work by Matthias Stein from the first time was 2012, as far as I know. And here it's a different approach. So the idea is you do not attach probabilities to the arguments themselves, but you specify a probability measure over the set of labelings. Okay, let's remember what this is. So take this example. It's the same example as before, where you have 5 arguments. Okay, so A1, A2, A3, A4, and A5, and there are some attacks between them. Each one of these arguments can be labeled accepted, rejected, or undecided. All right. So you have 5 to the third possible labelings, possible ways of labeling. Now, yeah, you can specify a probability measure over these 125 possible labelings, right? You can do that. Now, let's say just in this simple example that I placed a probability measure over these labelings, but I just had no zero probability of 4 labelings. And to make the example really simple, I took the 4 labelings that I had before. So these are the same labelings. And suppose I have each one of them with probability 1/4, 0.25. Okay, so I hope it's clear to you all what's happening. So we have an argumentation graph. This graph has many possible labelings. I can come and say, oh, look, I attach probabilities to the labelings. I don't really care about the labelings being complete, stable, whatever. So I don't care. I just place probabilities over them. Now, of course, it would be reasonable to place probabilities over labelings that are not filled with conflict. So you have to, if a labeling has an argument that attacks another, you cannot accept them all. So you should place probability 0 to that labeling. But anyway, so these 4 labelings are fine, they are admissible, they have no conflicts, and I placed probability 0 at 0.25 over each one of them. Now, I hope it's clear. If I ask you what is the probability that A3 is rejected, what is it? The probability that A3 is rejected is 0.75, right? I hope you can see that at this point. What is the probability that A1 is left undecided? Well, it's 0.25, right? What is the probability that A4 is left undecided? Well, it's half, right? Because there are 2 labelings where A4 is undecided, and they get each one of them gets probability 0.25. So, assuming this is clear enough, I hope this is clear. Now you can ask questions. So you can say, well, what's the probability that one argument is rejected or not? And what's the probability that the labeling is stable, the labeling is complete? You can ask many questions. And so, but then you can think the other way, right? So the way I presented this, which I think is easier to understand, is if you have a probability distribution over the labelings, then you can ask questions. But you can do things the other way around. So I could give you the graph, and the graph would simply impose. I could just say, well, the graph is imposing constraints on the probability distributions. So, for example, if A2 attacks A1, you cannot have a probability larger than 0 for a labeling that accepts both of them. You cannot accept both of them. So this is a constraint that the graph is imposing. Okay, and there are many other constraints that people have discussed. And Matthias Stein proposed this first, and then lots of people have proposed other constraints. So in this way of looking at the epistemic approach, let's see if that's clear. You have a graph. I gave you a graph. I gave you some probabilities over the graph. And the graph contains restrictions over the possible distributions over arguments. So when you think about it, it's really an indeterminate probability kind of thing, right? I give you constraints over probability measures, and I ask you to think about the set of possible measures that satisfy those constraints. That's what's happening, right? The language is different, but that's what's happening. So in this way of doing things, in the epistemic approach, basically you're dealing with credo sets. So you have arguments, you have attacks, and each attack is interpreted in as a constraint. For example, here's one property that people usually adopt. They usually adopt that if B attacks A, that must mean that the probability of A is smaller. So A is being attacked, right? So the probability of A must be smaller than the probability of 1 minus the probability of B. So if B has a high probability, A must have a small probability. Okay? I guess I hope that's clear. Now, this property is strangely called coherence, which I guess people from SIPTA will find really weird, because coherence means lots of other things in the theory of imprecise probabilities. But here, that's what it means. It means that attacks are interpreted this way. An attack imposes this constraint. Okay? Now, one thing that Matthias Stein proved back in 2012 is that if you adopt this coherence property, if you understand the graph as a collection of constraints of this sort, then the set of distributions that satisfy these constraints is closed and convex. Okay, which is not very surprising when you look back. And his prescription was that you should choose the distribution that has maximum entropy, which is okay. Well, it's not surprising either, but it's his proposal. And then there's lots of different properties that people have been proposing to interpret the constraints that happen to come from the graph. So the graph is now given. You may have other numbers, other probabilities, but then you understand all of these as constraints. So, for example, one instance is people will interpret that A is accepted if the probability of A is larger than 0.5. So the constraint here is if you accept A, it's because its probability is larger than half. If the probability is larger than half, you have to accept A. Another example, if B attacks A, then, well, here's another constraint. The probability of B being large implies that the probability of A must be small. Small and large in the sense of half, comparing with half. So the theme here is always the same. So you have a graph, you have some other numbers, you have some other constraints. You take them all, you interpret them as constraints and probabilities, and you see what is the set of probabilities that satisfy them. This set of probabilities is the set of probabilistic extensions of the argumentation graph and numbers. Okay, so I think the most interesting example, the most I guess the most ambitious language has been proposed to represent argumentation in the sense that I'm talking about here in this talk is the proposal by Anthony Hunter, which some of you may know is being a leading researcher in this area for many years. So epistemic graphs are being proposed by Tony Hunter, Sylvia Polberg, and Matthias Steen. They published a very long paper on this in 2020. And their idea, as far as I understand, is to have a very general language that can capture many different things that are important in argumentation. So here's an example that I took from one of his papers, one of their papers, to show you that what you have in an epistemic graph is an argumentation graph, is a graph where you have arguments and attacks and supports, and a bunch of constraints on probability values. And again, I will insist, this is just one way of defining, specifying a Credo set, if you think about it. So here at the left, you have the arguments, and you have arguments A, B, C, D, and then some arguments attack other arguments. That's when you have the minus sign. And some arguments actually now support other arguments. So in this framework, you even have supports. You can support an argument using a different argument. And then if you look at the right, and I'll leave this a minute here so that you can read, you see that there are many constraints that impose, these are constraints on probability values, right? They are not trivial constraints, but they are. So the first constraint is that either the probability of B is larger than half, or the probability of C is smaller than half, or the probability of D is smaller than half. This expression is equivalent to the probability of A being larger than half. So this is a constraint that it can express in their language. So what you would give is an argumentation graph, arguments, attacks, supports, and a bunch of constraints, and the person would basically construct a set of distributions that these distributions are the probabilistic extensions. And from those distributions, then you can answer questions. You can say, for example, what's the lower probability of an argument, the upper probability of an argument, and so on. Now, there's one thing that is a little strange in these epistemic frameworks. And what's strange is, what is the meaning of these probabilities? What do they mean, right? And it's a little difficult to understand what people are actually talking about when you read the papers. Some people say, well, the probabilities that you see in these constraints are the probabilities or beliefs that the arguments are true. Well, I suppose it's a little strange to say that an argument is true or not. I mean, if the argument is true, you should accept it, right? Why are you arguing if the argument is true? And then some other people will write, well, this is the probability of, or the belief that the argument is accepted. But this is also a little strange, because the whole point of the argumentation framework works is to decide when the argument is accepted or rejected. So there's been quite some discussion on what is it that these probabilities actually mean, right? What is the uncertainty that they carry? And I think this is sort of an open question. It's more like a philosophical question, but it's a practical question as well, because you got to know what you're talking about. And then I think this constellation approach and the epistemic approach are ways of dealing with the argumentation graphs when you have uncertainty about the arguments. But there's a different approach, and this to have probabilities into arguments. And this is an approach that appeared, well, it's appeared before this, but I think the first comprehensive proposal was by Dung, the same Dung that proposed argumentation frameworks, Dung and Thang in 2010. So what they said is, well, look, it's better, if you're dealing with probabilities, it's better to look into the structure of the arguments, right? So let's not just have these little boxes of arguments and probabilities over them. Let's have rules, facts, and associate probabilities with the facts, which may be uncertain, okay? So here's so their framework is based on a set of independent propositions that are associated with probabilities and sets of rules. And here's something I copied from from their first paper on this issue, actually. They have probabilities of over A1, over A2, and then they have a rule. And the rule basically says, well, if you're driving fast, then you're a negligent driver, provided the A1 is true. Okay, so, and they build a theory on how to think about this and how to manipulate these attacks. And actually, what they did was they defined how to extract attacks from these sets of rules and how to handle the attacks. I think the theory is a little difficult to apply. It was the first try, as far as I can see, but I think this was in the right direction, because basically it's really hard to have probabilities of arguments in a very abstract fashion. You have to look at the structure of the arguments to understand what's the meaning of the probabilities. Okay, so this is something I've been doing for last few years. So let me go into a more propaganda mode here, right? So I'll talk a little bit about things that I've been doing. I've been looking at argumentation frameworks where you have probabilities associated to facts. Again, this is a very small portion of what you could call argumentation in philosophy, right? But this is really a narrow thing. But basically, you have facts. Like, for example, you have the fact that there may be a strike with probability 0.5. And then you have rules, okay? And if you're familiar with logic programming, you will understand this as rules from logic programming. But if you're not familiar, don't worry. I will not use anything from logic programming. I will just explain what these rules mean, okay? The first rule says, well, if you're not using a bus, then you're using a car. That's the idea here. And if you're not using a car, and if there's not a strike, then use a bus. Okay, that's the idea. So if there's a strike, you cannot use a bus. That's the idea. So the idea here is that you have arguments, like you have arguments for using a car and for using a bus, and or arguments against these decisions that you may take. But you have the structure, you have rules on how they behave, how they are related. Okay, it's not just arrows in a graph. So how would you then calculate so how would you understand these rules in terms of argumentation frameworks? So you have an argument for using a car. It is attacked by the argument, by the decision that you could use a bus. If you use a bus, you cannot take a car. That's the first rule. If you're using a bus, you cannot take a car. If you use a car, you cannot take a bus. But you cannot take a bus if there's a strike. There's an attack on the bus thing. Now, what happens if I ask you, well, what's the probability that you use a car? So I want to know what's the probability of using a car. So I can look at the two possibilities. There's a strike with probability half, and there's not a strike with probability half, right? Because there's a probability associated with the fact strike. So if there's a strike, then you cannot use the bus. And if you cannot use the bus, then you use the car, right? So this is a situation where everything is under control. But if there is a strike, if there's not a strike, if there's no strike, then you can use a car or you can use a bus. It's not defined. There's something that is not specified in the rules. So you could use both ways. You could use a car, you can use a bus. It's not specified. And then what happens is, in the end, is car has at least probability 0.5, because at least when there's a strike, you have to use a car. But then it may go up as high as probability 1 for car, because you may just always use a car. But if you think about the bus, the lower probability of using a bus is 0, and the upper probability is half, because you cannot use a bus half of the time. right? So this is what happens when you have these rules and these probabilistic facts. You may have underdetermined situations that lead to probability intervals. I think the way to understand this is this. You have two scenarios. Either you have a strike or you don't have a strike. In one scenario, when you do have a strike, you just have one possibility for the world. When you do not have a strike, you have two possibilities, right? So there's a mapping from this space of strikes that may happen or may not happen to the space of things that happen with cars and buses. And I guess if you're familiar with Dempster-Shafer theory, you will see that there's a multivalued mapping from the space of things that have exact probability to a space of things that are consequences of the other ones. And so what happens is when you have a setting like this, where arguments are expressed by rules, and there may be facts that are associated with probabilities, what happens is that the structure of this is the structure of a random set, right? So the lower probabilities are like belief functions because they are infinitely monotone Choquet capacities, and that's what you get. So the interpretation of these structures is that you have a random set. So you're within many things that happen in imprecise probabilities. This is something I've been publishing on for some time, and there's a paper in IJAR in 2020 that looks at this. And recently at KR, we just had some results on this. And so let me just finish by saying why I'm, how is it that I'm using this stuff, right? How is it that we plan to use this? So we're building here in my lab a conversational agent that provides information about the Blue Amazon. Okay, what's the Blue Amazon? The Blue Amazon is the region of the ocean that is controlled by Brazil. This is a very large region. It's as large as the Amazon, the green Amazon. So people usually refer to this as the Blue Amazon. Okay, it's a huge region around Brazil. So we've been building here in my lab a portal where you can chat about the Blue Amazon. You can get news, automated news. You can get information. And one thing that we want to do is to build a more responsive chatbot, because what we have now is a chatbot that answers questions. You can ask questions about the Blue Amazon, okay? And it will say things like, well, it's the size of the Blue Amazon, what species you can find there, which what is the oil production. It will answer things. But what we want is to have a conversational agent that can actually argue on the topic of climate change. Okay, so what we're doing now is we're coding things about climate change in the ocean using rules. For example, here's an example. So it's this is translating knowledge that exists out there about the ocean and climate change. So if there's a major melting of icebergs in the Northern Atlantic, okay, and so water in the ocean will have less density unless there is more evaporation. Okay, so there are two things that may compensate each other, but if there is melting and no evaporation, then there will be decrease in the Atlantic density. The water density will decrease, and then it's likely there will be a collapse of the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation. This is a technical term. I will explain what that is in a moment, but this is a very bad thing. Okay, this will create a lot of trouble for many people. So these facts here, these rules, are coding things that are in the literature. And the way we code the likely is we will create a fact rule on that has high probability, just to mean that it's likely that the second rule will actually fire when when things happen. Let me explain what is the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation so that you understand what this rule is about. The Atlantic meridional overturning circulation is a flow of water So I think hot water goes to the north and cold water goes to the south, something like this. But it's a huge movement of water in the ocean. It's tons of water by second, and regulates the climate in Europe, in the United States, in Canada, in Brazil. And this circulation of water has been weakening in the past decades. And if you look at the literature, you will read sentences like, well, it's very likely that it will decline. And if it declines, then it's likely that it will collapse, meaning that it will stop, and then there will be real trouble. So what we're doing is we're getting this information, this knowledge about the ocean and climate, and building rules like this that can be used to argue about the ocean and climate change. So that's what we're doing. And this gets me into the last thing I want to say. This has nothing to do with imprecise probabilities, as far as I can see, but it's really an important issue in argumentation, in practical artificial intelligence systems that can argue. Well, this is the challenge of actually mining arguments from texts, from sources, from books, from documents. This is really difficult. So one must extract these arguments, must extract the text, and even must extract the uncertainty that you have all these arguments. The fact that things are likely, unlikely, very likely, this has to be extracted in some way, right? I will just skip a few things here and just mention that there are systems out there that do this sort of argumentation mining. One system, it's a French system by Serena Villata and collaborators, is a system that extracts arguments from the presidential debates in the United States, because these debates are recorded and you can actually mine arguments from them. So you can use this tool, you can see how it works. This is really a challenge. Okay, so this is something that is important for argumentation in practice. Of course, you have to have the arguments, but this is not something I'm talking about in this talk. So let me finish, because getting too late here. So what was my point here? So I wanted to say a couple of things. So at the very beginning, I said, well, AI has been very interested in representing uncertainty, and in particular in indeterminate and imprecise probabilities for decades, right? I think there's been a lot of work on probabilistic logic and credo networks, and I think they are really useful now for causal reasoning. But in this talk, I talked about probabilistic argumentation, right? And as far as I can see, almost all of the approaches that you have in literature, they are based on credo sets in one way or another, right? So they are really tied to imprecise probabilities, even when the actually authors are not aware, right? So people are just talking about constraints, probability constraints, but they are actually talking about indeterminate probabilities in some way. And I try to summarize what I see in the constellation and the epistemic approaches. They are really, there are many things that are really related to imprecise probabilities. And I mentioned briefly the work that I've been doing with what's called assumption-based argumentation, where you actually represent the structure of the arguments and how the uncertainty is distributed around facts. And so I guess that's what I wanted to say. Again, I will thank you for the audience, thank the organizers, thanks for the nice invitation. Thanks a lot.